She sits in a great brownstone mansion on Fifth Avenue, its walls heavy with velvet drapes and oil paintings of ancestors whose faces seem carved from another age. Caroline Astor does not wear a crown, nor does she rule by decree. Yet in the glittering chaos of the Gilded Age, the age of steel fortunes, robber barons, and gilded illusions, her name alone carries the weight of an empire. One invitation from her hand can raise a family into the pantheon of New York society. One absence can doom a fortune to obscurity. She rules, not with armies, but with guest lists, not with laws, but with silence. It is a paradox, a woman in a century that denies her political voice, yet she becomes the final arbiter of power in the nation's richest city. Men like Cornelius Vanderbilt or J.P. Morgan command railroads and banks, but their wives and daughters whisper of only one question: will Mrs. Astor acknowledge us? The drawing rooms of Manhattan are her court. The great ballroom of her mansion, fitted with gold chandeliers and silk wallpaper imported from Europe, becomes her throne room. From here, she dictates who belongs and who is exiled, who may marry and who must be forgotten. Historians often point to 1888, the year Caroline Astor and her trusted ally Ward McAllister coined the 400, the supposed number of people in New York society who mattered, the ones who fit into the ballroom of her Fifth Avenue home. The number was arbitrary, but the message was clear. Not wealth alone, but pedigree and acceptance by Mrs. Astor defined true high society. And so families worth millions clawed desperately for her approval, bribing with jewels, begging for introductions, reshaping their very identities to pass her judgment. But behind this veneer of order lies a darker truth. Caroline Astor's throne is invisible, and so it is also fragile. She rules by enforcing rules that no one dares to write down, rules that can shift with the flicker of her disapproval. A woman who wore the wrong gown could be banished for seasons. A man whose fortune was too new could find himself shut out no matter how lavish his gifts. Gossip was her army, reputation her sword. To be noticed by her was to exist. To be ignored was to vanish. Yet the paradox of her reign is haunting. For while she is queen of society, she is prisoner of it as well. Her public image, dignified, restrained, untouchable, is not just her weapon but her shackle. She cannot falter, cannot forgive too freely, cannot betray weakness. Some whispered she longed for a softer life, away from the constant battle of appearances, but such longing was dangerous. She is, in the end, a woman consumed by the very world she created. One scandalous rumor followed her through the years: that even within her own family, she was not always the gentle matriarch she presented. Her husband, William Backhouse Astor Jr., preferred yachting and quiet retreats, rarely accompanying her to the grand affairs. Some whispered that their marriage was strained, that her true passion was not her husband, but her empire of influence. Others hinted at her iron hand in controlling her children's marriages, steering them not toward affection, but toward alliances that preserved the Astor name. Love in her household was always secondary to legacy. Still, her myth grew. She became a figure both revered and feared. At the opera, her arrival silenced murmurs, and all eyes turned to the grand box where she sat draped in black silk and diamonds, her face composed into a mask of serene authority. Servants described her presence as chilling, as though she carried an invisible weight that filled the room. She never raised her voice, never descended into vulgarity, and yet, without saying a word, she could condemn or exalt. Some historians wonder if she truly believed in the world she guarded, or if she, too, recognized its absurdity. The Gilded Age was an illusion, a time when the poor starved in tenements while millionaires feasted under crystal chandeliers. Perhaps Caroline Astor knew that the empire she ruled was already crumbling, that the tide of new money, new ideas, and new freedoms would soon wash away the proud fortress of her society. Perhaps her rigidity, her insistence on rules and boundaries, was not arrogance, but fear. The fear of a woman clinging to a world that was already vanishing before her eyes. And so the story begins with a contradiction. A woman without crown or parliament, ruling an empire of appearances more powerful than steel or gold. She is the Queen of New York, but her throne is made of smoke and mirrors. And like all thrones built on whispers, it will one day dissolve into silence. The year is 1870, and New York City is a place of restless glitter and hidden decay. The Civil War has ended, yet its ghosts still linger in the alleyways where immigrants struggle for scraps of work. Along Broadway, carriages rattle past gas lamps and theaters where the nouveau rich flaunt fortunes built on railroads, steel, and oil. The newspapers christen it the Gilded Age, not because the world is truly golden, but because everything is covered in a thin, deceptive sheen of wealth. Beneath the shimmer, poverty festers, and class divisions cut deeper than any wound of battle. Caroline Astor stands at the center of this paradox. She is born into an old Dutch family, the Schermerhorns, whose roots in New York stretch back to the 17th century, when the city was still New Amsterdam. Her bloodline is her armor. Unlike the Vanderbilts, whose fortune rises from railroads, or the Goulds, who squeeze millions from speculation, the Schermerhorns possess something money alone cannot buy: history. To Caroline, lineage is the very marrow of society. Money is necessary, but blood is destiny. The great battle of the Gilded Age is not fought with guns or ballots, but with drawing rooms, opera boxes, and invitations. The old families, Astors, Livingstons, Van Rensselaers, see themselves as guardians of tradition, keepers of refinement against the vulgarity of new money. Yet their enemies are powerful. The Vanderbilts, newly minted millionaires, build palaces of marble and granite, importing European treasures by the shipload, daring to rival the prestige of families who once considered them little more than upstarts. It is here that the rules of high society are sharpened into weapons. A woman's gown must be Parisian, but not ostentatious. A man may be wealthy, but if he worked for his fortune rather than inherited it, he carries a permanent stain. Even the number of guests at a dinner party, the sequence of dances at a ball, the choice of china or wine, all become coded signals of belonging. Caroline understands these signals better than anyone, and she begins to codify them into an unspoken constitution. The city itself becomes her stage. Along Fifth Avenue, mansions rise like temples, each family striving to outshine the other in size, grandeur, and excess. The newspapers describe their ballrooms in rapturous detail: ceilings painted like Renaissance cathedrals, staircases of carved marble, fountains gushing with champagne. Yet all this opulence is meaningless without one thing: the approval of Mrs. Astor. A Vanderbilt ball may dazzle the press, but if Caroline does not attend, it is as though the event never happened. She wields absence like a blade. But beyond the glitter lies cruelty. For every family admitted into her circle, dozens are left outside, condemned to linger on the margins of society despite their wealth. One scandalous story whispers of a woman who spent a fortune on jewels and gowns, only to find her name never appeared on Caroline's lists. When she dared to confront Mrs. Astor, she was met with cold silence, and from that day forward, no respectable hostess in New York would receive her. Caroline had spoken, and her word was final. Some historians argue that this system of exclusion was not merely vanity, but survival. The city was swelling with millionaires. By the 1890s, there were said to be more than 4,000 families worth over $1 million each. Without boundaries, the entire notion of society would collapse under its own weight. Caroline's iron hand was, in a sense, an attempt to preserve coherence in a world where fortunes could be made and lost in a single reckless gamble on Wall Street. Yet others suggest a darker motive: that Caroline Astor delighted in her role as gatekeeper, that she relished the power of deciding who belonged and who did not. In a world where women were denied the vote and often treated as ornaments to their husband's success, Caroline found a different throne to seize. By mastering the art of appearances, she turned her parlor into a parliament and her guest list into law. Still, the cracks were visible even then. The Gilded Age, for all its brilliance, is haunted by its shadows. While the elite waltz under chandeliers, labor strikes erupt in the streets. Immigrants pile into tenements where sewage leaks through the walls and disease spreads unchecked. The very families Caroline excludes from her salons are often the same ones whose factories exploit the poor. The illusion of refinement is built on the suffering of the invisible. And perhaps she knows this. Perhaps she senses that her empire of manners floats above a sea of unrest that cannot be held back forever. For now, though, the illusion holds. Caroline Astor reigns supreme, draped in silk, her expression carved in marble composure. She presides over a world that pretends to be eternal, even as it teeters on the edge of collapse. And with every whispered scandal, every desperate petition for her recognition, her legend grows. Caroline Webster Schermerhorn was born in 1830 into a family that believed itself woven into the very fabric of New York. The Schermerhorns were not the richest of the Old Dutch stock, but their bloodline carried weight, and Caroline was raised to understand that heritage was the truest currency of all. From the moment she could walk across a polished floor without stumbling, she was groomed for a life where appearances were destiny. Her childhood was marked by rigid rituals, French lessons, piano practice, long afternoons of embroidery under her mother's watchful eye. She grew up in a house where silence was expected, where children were seen but rarely heard, and where every gesture was meant to reflect dignity. There were parties. Yes, polite gatherings of old families where whispers of alliances and fortunes drifted like smoke in the air. But Caroline learned quickly that these rooms were not simply for dancing or conversation. They were training grounds, arenas where one mistake could tarnish a family name. Even as a girl, she carried herself with a gravity that unsettled others. Servants recalled how she would stare with unblinking eyes, listening more than speaking, storing away what she heard. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. Her features were strong, her gaze direct. But she radiated an authority that seemed far older than her years. Some later remarked that she always seemed to be waiting, even in her youth, as though she knew her destiny was not to follow, but to command. The turning point came with her marriage to William Backhouse Astor Jr., heir to one of America's greatest fortunes. The Astors were already legendary. John Jacob Astor, the family patriarch, had clawed his way to riches through fur trading and Manhattan real estate, becoming the nation's first multimillionaire. By the time Caroline married into the dynasty, the Astor fortune had become synonymous with power. Yet the family itself was divided. The elder line, descending from John Jacob's eldest son, held sway in Europe. Caroline's branch, her husband's, remained in New York, wealthy but overshadowed. It was here that Caroline found her purpose. She would not merely marry into the Astors, she would elevate them. She sensed that fortune alone was fragile, that money could vanish with a market crash. But reputation could endure for generations. And so she began the work of remaking herself, sculpting not just her own identity, but that of her family. Her tools were not jewels or gowns, though she possessed plenty of both. They were subtler things. The glance withheld at an opera, the invitation delivered with exquisite timing, the calculated decision to arrive late and ensure every head turned as she entered. She studied the codes of European aristocracy, then reshaped them into something distinctly American. She became, in essence, an architect of illusion. Yet within the Astor household, contradictions festered. William preferred yachting, hunting, and long summers in the countryside. He had little taste for society's endless performances. Rumors spread that he grew weary of his wife's ambitions, that he retreated further and further into his own diversions as Caroline sharpened her grip on the city. Some even whispered that their marriage was one of convenience more than passion, that Caroline's true partner in power was not her husband, but Ward McAllister, the social strategist who became her confidant. Still, Caroline persevered. She learned to use the Astor mansion as both fortress and stage. Every carpet, every chandelier, every gilded chair was chosen not simply for beauty, but for message. Her dinners were orchestrated with the precision of military campaigns. Guests were seated not merely by rank, but by the delicate hierarchies only she could see. Who might sit near whom, whose proximity elevated or diminished another. A misplaced guest could cause a scandal. A well-placed one could cement an alliance. Scandal followed in quieter ways, too. Whispers circulated that Caroline could be ruthless even with her children, pushing them toward marriages that benefited the family name. Her daughter's love for a less prestigious suitor was said to have been crushed beneath her mother's disapproval. Others murmured that Caroline herself felt imprisoned by the very stage she had built, that behind the velvet curtains she sometimes longed for the freedom of anonymity. Some historians argue that Caroline's rise was inevitable, that in a society where women were barred from politics and finance, someone would inevitably seize power in the only arena left to them, the drawing room. Others, however, suggest her hunger was personal, born not merely of circumstance, but of ambition, a fire that consumed her, driving her to shape an empire of manners and exclusion that outlived her. By the 1870s, Caroline was no longer just another Astor. She was Mrs. Astor, the article before her name not a title but a coronation. In a city boiling with new fortunes, she became the immovable center, the figure who defined the boundaries of belonging. The girl raised in the Schermerhorn household had become the queen of a world built on fragile rules and fierce illusions. And yet, as her reign began, so too did her battles. For the world beyond her drawing rooms was shifting, and not even Caroline Astor could keep the tide from rising. The year is 1883, and a storm of silk and scandal is gathering. Caroline Astor, now firmly enthroned as the matriarch of New York society, has begun to craft her masterpiece, the codification of high society into a single, dazzling circle. It will not be open to all who are rich. It will be reserved for those she deems worthy. This circle will be called the 400. The idea is born from whispers between Caroline and her trusted lieutenant, Ward McAllister, a man who knows gossip as a banker knows numbers. Together, they decide that society must have boundaries, that without them it would be swallowed by the flood of millionaires pouring into the city. McAllister declares that there are only about 400 people in New York who truly matter, a number that, by no coincidence, matches the capacity of Mrs. Astor's Fifth Avenue ballroom. It is not a fact, but a decree, one that will shape the ambitions and humiliations of countless families. To belong to the 400 is to be immortalized. To be excluded is to be erased. Invitations to Mrs. Astor's annual ball become golden tickets, fought over more fiercely than political appointments. A family may own railroads, oil fields, or steel empires, but without Caroline's acceptance, they remain outsiders, condemned to watch the glitter from the cold. Her mansion becomes her battlefield. Built not as a home but as a weapon, it looms at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 34th Street, its facade stern, its interiors dripping with velvet and gilt. Here, Caroline orchestrates nights of music, champagne, and waltzes, each movement choreographed like a liturgy. To dine in her presence is to kneel at her altar. To dance beneath her chandeliers is to be baptized into her society. One famous scandal illustrates her power. When Caroline hears that Alva Vanderbilt has built a palatial mansion on Fifth Avenue, grander than any Astor residence, she refuses to recognize it. The Vanderbilts, for all their money, are still considered tainted with the vulgarity of new wealth. Invitations from Alva are declined, her efforts to break into society mocked. But Alva is not a woman to be ignored. In March of 1883, she hosts the most extravagant ball New York has ever seen. An event so opulent that the newspapers dedicate pages to describing the costumes, the jewels, the feasts. The entire city is mesmerized. The scandalous twist? Caroline Astor's daughter is desperate to attend, but her name is absent from the guest list. Only when Caroline herself calls upon Alva in person, a concession she never makes, does the Vanderbilt name finally breach the gates of society. It is a humiliating moment, though Caroline veils it with dignity. Some historians suggest she never forgave herself for that capitulation, that in acknowledging the Vanderbilts, she cracked the very foundation of her empire. Others argue it was inevitable, that no fortress, however carefully built, could withstand the tidal wave of wealth reshaping America. Behind the scenes, Caroline grows harder, sharper. She insists upon rigid rules. Women must leave their calling cards at her door at the proper hour. Men must attend her dinners in immaculate white tie. No one may rise above their station without her sanction. Gossip flows through her salons like wine, and she listens with the patience of a chess master, deciding who may be elevated and who must be sacrificed. One careless affair, one public scandal, and a family can be cast out forever. Yet for all her precision, she cannot silence the rumors. Some whisper that her obsession with control masks a private loneliness, that her husband's absence from her balls speaks of a marriage hollowed out by indifference. Others say she is haunted by her children's futures, fearful that they will squander the legacy she has built. And still others, more unkind, suggest that Caroline herself is a prisoner of the very rules she enforces, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making. But in the grand halls of New York, none of this weakness shows. When she enters the opera house, draped in black satin, diamonds glittering at her throat, the entire audience rises as if in reverence. She is Mrs. Astor, and her word is law. For now, at least, the throne is secure, and the 400 dance beneath her gaze as though the empire of appearances will last forever. The feud begins like a whisper, but grows into thunder. On one side stands Caroline Astor, guardian of tradition, whose approval is worth more than gold. On the other, Alva Vanderbilt, the daughter of a Confederate officer and the ambitious wife of William K. Vanderbilt, grandson of the rail magnate. Alva is younger, bolder, and armed with a fortune so vast it dwarfs the old family's pretensions. To Caroline, the Vanderbilts represent everything she despises: vulgarity, ostentation, the arrogance of money without pedigree. Alva does not intend to remain outside the gates. She has built her palace. Yes, palace, for nothing less could describe it, on Fifth Avenue, its limestone facade rising like a gauntlet thrown at Caroline's feet. Inside are ballrooms modeled after Versailles, fountains carved from imported marble, staircases that ascend like a coronation. The message is clear. The Vanderbilts have arrived, and they will not be ignored. Caroline's weapon is silence. For years, she declines Alva's invitations, refuses to utter her name in society. To attend a Vanderbilt ball would be to acknowledge their legitimacy, and that is something she cannot allow. But Alva is no ordinary adversary. She is clever, cunning, and willing to wield scandal as a sword. In March of 1883, she plans an event so lavish it will become legend, the Vanderbilt Masquerade Ball. The city trembles with anticipation. Costumes are commissioned from Paris, each gown a fortune in silk and embroidery. Guests arrive dressed as queens, shepherdesses, knights, and gods, their jewels blazing like captured stars. The press devours every detail: the rivers of champagne, the fountains flowing with punch, the endless banquet of delicacies. It is not merely a ball. It is a spectacle designed to humiliate those who are absent. And the most glaring absence is Mrs. Astor herself. Here lies the trap. Caroline's daughter, Carrie, longs to attend, but her name is missing from the guest list. Alva has made her point. Even the Astors cannot ignore the Vanderbilts forever. Caroline, trapped by her daughter's pleas, is forced to do the unthinkable. She calls on Alva Vanderbilt in person, leaving her calling card at the mansion's grand door. With that single gesture, the barrier collapses. Alva triumphs. The Vanderbilts are admitted to society. It is a wound Caroline cannot conceal. Some historians claim that moment marked the beginning of the end of her dominance, the instant when the tide of new money breached the fortress of old names. Others argue she still retained her crown, that the very act of visiting Alva proved her magnanimity, her ability to bend without breaking. Yet the truth is more fragile. For the first time, Caroline is forced to bow, not to a monarch, not to a statesman, but to another woman who refused to be ignored. Behind the velvet curtains, tensions ripple. Gossip hisses that Caroline privately despised Alva, but recognized her brilliance. Some even suggest that she admired her rival's daring, though she would never admit it aloud. But admiration does not soften rivalry. In the years that follow, Caroline and Alva battle in subtler ways: competing balls, competing alliances, competing visions of society. The Astors symbolize dignity and restraint, the Vanderbilts, audacity and display. Together, they create a theater of power in which every dance, every gown, every whispered scandal becomes part of a larger war. The newspapers feed on the drama. They christen Caroline the Mrs. Astor, the embodiment of tradition, while Alva is painted as the insurgent, the queen of glitter and defiance. The city watches, enthralled, as these two women wield their fortunes and reputations like generals in a war without bloodshed. But beneath the sparkle lies rot. Families ruined themselves to win approval, spending fortunes on gowns and dinners they could ill afford. Young women were married off like pawns, their happiness sacrificed for alliances. Caroline, once the sole queen, now finds her power diluted, her throne shared with rivals she cannot silence. And the irony is bitter. The very world she fought to preserve is beginning to fracture, undone by the weight of its own excess. Still, she does not yield. At the opera, she sits in her box, her gaze cool, her diamonds a declaration that she remains unshaken. But in her heart, she must know that the war has changed her. The Vanderbilts are no longer at the gates. They are inside the ballroom, dancing beneath her chandeliers. Behind the velvet curtain of Caroline Astor's carefully orchestrated empire, shadows stir. To the outside world, she is the embodiment of composure, serene, majestic, untouchable. But in private, the portrait begins to crack. Her marriage to William Backhouse Astor Jr. is a hollow shell. He spends his days yachting, retreating to the countryside, or drifting through the clubs of New York, leaving Caroline to reign alone. Some whisper that he resents the weight of her ambitions, that he is a man eclipsed by his wife's hunger for power. Others suggest that he quietly approves, content to let her rule the drawing rooms while he slips into obscurity. What is certain is that the great Mrs. Astor's husband is almost invisible, absent from the spectacles that define her legacy. In his absence, Caroline turns her family into instruments of her will. Her children's marriages are not matters of affection, but of strategy. When her daughter Charlotte dares to fall in love with a man outside Caroline's vision for the family, the match is crushed. Her son, John Jacob IV, flamboyant and restless, becomes a source of endless scandal, his gambling debts whispered about in the very salons his mother controls. Caroline maneuvers, shields and scolds, desperate to keep the Astor name unsullied. But she cannot contain everything. Whispers of family discord slip through the cracks, and the queen of society finds herself playing defense even in her own household. Her closest ally remains Ward McAllister, the courtier of society, who flatters her genius and spreads her decrees through the city. Together, they maintain the fiction of harmony and order. Yet McAllister, too, begins to falter. In 1892, he publishes a book titled Society as I Have Found It, a gossipy memoir that reveals too much about the hidden workings of New York's elite. The backlash is swift, brutal. Families who once trusted him turn cold, scandalized by his betrayal. Caroline, by association, is wounded. Her kingdom, once so carefully concealed, is suddenly dragged into the light, its hypocrisies exposed. The contradictions of her reign grow heavier. She preaches refinement and restraint, yet her balls consume fortunes that could feed thousands. She guards the gates of society against the vulgarity of new money, yet she herself has been forced to yield to the Vanderbilts and others like them. She insists upon dignity, yet she presides over a world sustained by gossip, rivalry, and humiliation. Some historians argue that she believed in the world she built, that she saw herself as protector of an aristocracy America was too young to possess. Others wonder if she knew it was theater all along, and if the mask of Mrs. Astor was one she wore not only for the city, but for herself. One scandal cuts especially deep. In 1897, during the construction of her son John Jacob IV's new hotel, the Waldorf Astoria, family tensions spill into the public eye. Cousins feud over property lines and profits, dragging the Astor name into newspapers filled with unseemly quarrels. For Caroline, who has built her life on the illusion of unity and grace, it is a humiliation. The queen of society cannot silence her own blood, and still she plays her role. At the opera, at the dinners, at the endless stream of balls, she appears in her widow's black, her diamonds glittering like frost against the shadows. But those who look closely begin to see the strain, the stiffness of her smile, the weariness in her eyes. She is no longer a woman in control, but a woman desperately trying to hold together a world that is beginning to unravel. In the drawing rooms, where laughter echoes and champagne flows, some whisper that the queen is trapped, that Caroline Astor, who built her empire on rules and exclusion, has become prisoner of her own design. To break those rules now would be to admit they were never sacred, merely inventions of her will. And so she clings to them, even as they strangle her. The curtain is still drawn, the stage still lit, but behind it, the queen is already haunted by the truth. Her reign cannot last. By the closing years of the 19th century, the world Caroline Astor had so carefully cultivated was slipping away from her. Time itself seemed to conspire against her. The 400, once the arbiter of who mattered and who did not, had become a relic, mocked by journalists, resented by those excluded, and increasingly irrelevant in a city that pulsed with new wealth, new ambition, and a new appetite for spectacle. New York was no longer a quiet provincial capital aspiring to European refinement. It had become the beating heart of American capitalism, bursting with millionaires who had no patience for rules written in someone else's parlor. The Vanderbilts, once outsiders she tolerated, now ruled their own dazzling spheres. Their Fifth Avenue mansions dwarfed hers. Their entertainments rivaled the greatest courts of Europe. and their name became synonymous with the sheer magnitude of modern fortune. In comparison, the Astors, who had once seemed unassailable, were beginning to look like ghosts from an earlier age. Caroline, now well into her 70s, tried to cling to ritual. She still hosted receptions in her vast home, though her health was failing and her body weakened. Guests would arrive to find her seated, regal and remote, the diamonds heavy on her breast, her voice thinner, but her authority intact. Yet those same guests often left with the sense that they had stepped into a museum, a living exhibit of a society already fading into myth. The irony was cruel. The woman who had built New York society could not save it from change. The 20th century dawned with a hunger for progress, for speed, for innovation. Automobiles rattled down the streets, electricity lit the skyline, skyscrapers rose where brownstones once stood. The world had no time for the rigid codes of the Gilded Age. The children of the wealthy preferred Paris, Newport, or Europe to the stiff rituals of Caroline's ballroom. They wanted laughter, freedom, indulgence, not etiquette manuals and lists of the chosen few. Even within her family, the erosion was visible. John Jacob Astor IV, her flamboyant son, epitomized the new world she could not control. Divorced and remarried, he courted scandal openly. His new young wife, Madeline Force, became a fixture of gossip columns, and their marriage was seen as a final break from the strict moral veneer Caroline had spent her life protecting. It was a fracture that hurt her deeply, though she never admitted it in public. And then, in 1908, Caroline Astor died. She was 80 years old. Her funeral was as grand as her life had been. Black carriages, veils, and flowers blanketed in silence. The city turned out to pay its respects, not only to the woman, but to the age she represented. Yet even as mourners bowed their heads, there was a sense that they were burying more than Caroline. They were burying the last breath of a world she had kept alive through sheer force of will. In the years that followed, her son John Jacob IV would perish aboard the Titanic, his body lost to the icy Atlantic. The Astor fortune remained vast, their name etched into hotels and city streets, but their dominance in society was gone. New York had moved on. The city belonged to new magnates, new dynasties, new energies that Caroline would not have recognized. And yet, her ghost lingers. Every time historians speak of the 400, every time a novel or television series conjures the glittering ballrooms of the Gilded Age, Caroline's presence hovers like perfume in the air. She is remembered not for warmth, nor for kindness, but for her unyielding vision of power. She carved society from nothing and ruled it as though it were a kingdom, imposing order on chaos, beauty on vulgarity, rules on rebellion. Her legacy is a paradox. She preserved a dream of aristocracy in a nation that claimed to despise titles. She built a social hierarchy in a republic founded on equality. She wielded power without office, wealth without invention, and influence without kindness. To her admirers, she was the last great lady of New York, the guardian of civilization. To her critics, she was a tyrant in silk, a woman who turned the joy of human company into a chessboard for her own supremacy. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the tragedy of Caroline Astor lies not in what she achieved, but in what she could never escape, that the world she ruled was always an illusion, destined to vanish the moment she loosened her grip. When the velvet curtains fall, when the chandeliers are dark, when the diamonds are locked away, the queen's reign is over. All that remains is the whisper of silk on marble floors, and the knowledge that for one brief, glittering moment, Caroline Astor made New York her stage. The end comes slowly, not with a single shattering blow, but as a gradual dimming, like a grand chandelier flickering before surrendering to darkness. Caroline Astor, once the embodiment of New York's social order, begins to fade from the glittering world she built with such precision. The balls grow smaller, the guest lists thinner, and the appetite for her rigid rules dissolves with the passing years. By the early 20th century, the Gilded Age itself is collapsing, giving way to new fortunes, new amusements, new freedoms that make her world feel antiquated, even absurd. Her body, too, begins to betray her. Failing health confines her more often to her home, and the whispers that once trembled with awe now circle around her fragility. The grande dame of Fifth Avenue becomes a shadow behind heavy curtains, glimpsed only rarely, like a relic too precious to discard, but too fragile to display. Some claim that she never accepted the changing times, that she clung to the memory of her rule even as the world moved past her. Others suggest a softer decline, that perhaps she found a strange comfort in the quiet, a release from decades of performance. Yet even in silence, her influence lingers. Younger hostesses imitate her mannerisms, old families continue to invoke her name, and her daughter-in-law, Ava Lowell Willing, tries to uphold the Astor dominance but cannot carry the same weight. The 400 shrinks into myth, and the idea of an absolute social gatekeeper dissolves in the democratic chaos of the new century. Still, Caroline's name holds a gravity few can escape. To be acknowledged by her, even in her absence, remains a mark of legitimacy. She dies in 1908 at the age of 78. The newspapers proclaim the end of an era, their headlines dripping with nostalgia for a world already vanishing. Crowds gather outside, craning for a glimpse of mourning carriages, as if her passing were a public spectacle, a final performance in the endless theater of society. Her coffin is draped not only in fabric, but in the weight of decades, the symbol of a reign that had no throne, no crown, and yet commanded obedience. In death, her contradictions sharpen. Some mourn her as a guardian of refinement, a woman who elevated New York into a cultural capital. Others dismiss her as a tyrant of drawing rooms, a gatekeeper who confused exclusion with elegance. Still others suggest she was both, a woman who embodied the best and worst of her time, a figure who both created and caged the society she ruled. The legacy she leaves is one of shadows and echoes. The Astor name endures in hotels, in buildings, in whispered stories of glittering parties that feel like fairy tales. But Caroline herself becomes more spectral, a ghost lingering at the edge of memory, her rigid smile carved into the marble of history. Some historians argue that without her, the Gilded Age would have been chaos, its glitter wasted in formless excess. Others wonder if her control smothered what might have been a freer, more daring society. Her daughter, Ava, and later generations of Astors will continue to wrestle with the inheritance of her name. But Caroline's shadow looms too large, and the world too quickly transforms. Jazz replaces waltzes, skyscrapers rise higher than any ballroom ceiling, and the rigid codes she once enforced dissolve into the swirl of modernity. Her reign ends not because she falters, but because the stage itself is torn down, replaced by another theater, another audience. And yet, when one speaks of the Gilded Age, her name remains the first to be uttered, a talisman of its extravagance and its cruelty, its brilliance and its emptiness. Caroline Astor is both queen and ghost, both flesh and legend. Her story does not vanish, it lingers, haunting, in every retelling of America's Age of Gold. The lights dim, the music stills, and her figure recedes into the dark corridors of history. What remains is not simply a woman, but an aura, a symbol, a reminder that power can exist in the fragile confines of reputation, and that empires need no armies to command obedience. Caroline Astor's world may be gone, but the echo of her rule continues, faint as a whisper over a ballroom floor long since abandoned.